The klaxon alarm that shattered the pre-dawn silence at Whitmore Air Force Base wasn't supposed to exist. According to every manual, every protocol, every piece of official documentation, that particular warning system had been discontinued 3 years ago. But Staff Sergeant Maria Mari Rodriguez knew better. She'd been tracking discrepancies in the base's equipment records for months, filing reports that nobody read, maintaining files that everyone dismissed as bureaucratic excess. When that alarm screamed across the tarmac at 0347 hours, alerting the base to a catastrophic fuel contamination that would have killed every pilot scheduled to fly that morning, Mari's obsessive record-keeping became the difference between a routine training exercise and the worst aviation disaster in Air Force history. But getting to that moment, the moment when Paperwork Mari became the woman who saved 47 lives with nothing but a filing cabinet and an encyclopedic knowledge of regulatory contradictions, required surviving 4 years of institutional mockery, systematic dismissal, and the crushing weight of being right in a world that rewarded being wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Building 127 flickered with the same irregular rhythm they'd maintained for the past 18 months, casting intermittent shadows across rows of gunmetal gray filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling like a paper fortress. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, 28, sat hunched over her desk at 0630 hours, already 3 hours into her workday while most of the base was still contemplating their first cup of coffee. Mari's workspace was a study in organized obsession. 3 computer monitors displayed different databases simultaneously, equipment inventories, maintenance schedules, and regulatory updates that most personnel ignored until crisis demanded their attention. Stacks of precisely arranged documents covered every available surface, each pile representing a different system failure he'd identified, tracked, and documented, with the methodical precision of a man who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. At 5 feet 6 inches with dark brown hair pulled back in a regulation bun and intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing, Mari possessed the kind of understated competence that made her simultaneously invaluable and invisible in most professional situations. Her uniform was always properly pressed, her boots consistently polished to regulation standard, but something about her demeanor suggested a woman who'd learned that drawing attention usually meant inviting trouble. What set Mari apart wasn't her appearance or her social skills, it was her mind. Where other airmen saw paperwork as a necessary evil to be completed as quickly as possible, Mari saw patterns, discrepancies, and connections that revealed the hidden reality behind official narratives. She could cross-reference supply chain data with maintenance reports and identify equipment failures 6 months before they occurred. She noticed when serial numbers didn't match delivery manifests, when inspection dates conflicted with operational schedules, when regulatory changes invalidated existing protocols in ways that nobody else seemed to recognize or care about. The morning sun was climbing over the eastern hangar complex when Captain Rebecca Thompson appeared in the doorway of Building 127, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd drawn the short straw for unpleasant assignments. At 34, Thompson was old enough to have learned that the Air Force ran on bureaucracy, young enough to still believe that competence should matter more than politics. "Morning, Mari," she said, settling into the chair across from her desk that served as the unofficial confession booth for officers who needed miracles performed with impossible deadlines and insufficient resources. "I've got another special project for you." Mari looked up from a maintenance discrepancy report that revealed a troubling pattern in hydraulic system failures across the base's F-16 fleet. Thompson was one of the few officers who treated her with something approaching professional respect, possibly because she'd witnessed firsthand Mari's ability to locate obscure documentation that could save careers and solve problems that seemed impossible. "What's the situation, Captain?" "Colonel Harrison needs a complete audit of our fuel delivery systems," Thompson explained, consulting a tablet that displayed the kind of urgent tasking that usually preceded congressional investigations or court-martial proceedings. "Apparently there are questions about our inventory accuracy, some discrepancy between what we're paying for and what we're actually receiving." Mari's hands stopped moving across her keyboard. Fuel system discrepancies weren't just administrative headaches. They were potential death sentences for pilots who trusted that their aircraft contained the specified fuel loads with the correct additives and octane ratings. How significant are the discrepancies? Significant enough that Colonel Harrison spent an hour on the phone with Wing Command this morning, Thompson replied grimly. He needs documentation going back 3 years, cross-referenced with delivery manifests, quality control reports, and usage logs. Standard turnaround time for this kind of request is usually 6 weeks. When does he need it? Thursday. Mari glanced at her wall calendar. Today was Monday. Thompson was asking her to compile and analyze 3 years of fuel system data in less than 4 days, a task that would challenge a team of specialists working with unlimited resources and administrative support. For a single airwoman working alone in a basement office with outdated computer systems, it bordered on impossible. "I'll get started immediately," Mari said, already pulling files from her meticulously organized system. Thompson paused in the doorway, studying her with the curious expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Mari, can I ask you something? Why do you do this job the way you do it? I mean, most people in your position would do the minimum required and call it good. You treat every request like it's a matter of national security." Mari was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain something that she'd never fully articulated, even to herself. "Captain, every piece of paper that crosses this desk represents someone's life. Maintenance logs determine whether a pilot comes home from a training mission. Fuel quality reports decide whether an engine fails at 30,000 feet or performs flawlessly during combat operations. Supply manifests affect whether our mechanics have the parts they need to keep aircraft airworthy." She gestured toward the filing cabinets that dominated the room. "People see paperwork as bureaucratic waste, but I see it as the nervous system of everything we do here. When the documentation is wrong, people die. When it's accurate and complete, missions succeed and everyone goes home to their families." Thompson nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You know, Mari, I've been in the Air Force for 12 years, and I've never heard anyone explain administrative work that way." "Maybe that's the problem," Mari replied, turning back to her computer screens, where fuel delivery data was already beginning to populate her analysis spreadsheets. As Thompson's footsteps faded down the corridor, Mari began the process that had made her both invaluable and invisible at Whitmore Air Force Base. She accessed databases that most personnel didn't know existed, cross-referenced information that had never been compared, and began identifying patterns that revealed uncomfortable truths about base operations. The fuel delivery discrepancies weren't random accounting errors. They were systematic, consistent, and suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate manipulation in the supply chain. Over the past 3 years, the base had paid for premium aviation fuel while receiving substandard alternatives that met minimum specifications but lacked the performance additives that could mean the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. By 1,100 hours, Mari had identified 23 separate instances where fuel quality reports had been falsified to hide the substitution of inferior products. By 1,300 hours, she'd traced the pattern back to a specific supplier whose billing practices suggested coordination with base personnel who had access to quality control documentation. By 1,500 hours, she'd compiled evidence of what appeared to be a systematic conspiracy to defraud the Air Force while potentially compromising pilot safety. The weight of discovery settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Mari had stumbled onto something that went far beyond simple administrative errors. This was evidence of criminal activity that could end careers, trigger federal investigations, and potentially explain recent maintenance issues that had been attributed to normal wear and tear. Her phone rang at 1,547 hours, interrupting her analysis of fuel additive specifications that revealed just how dangerous the substituted products could be under combat conditions. Building 127, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez speaking. "Mari, this is Captain Stevens from Maintenance Operations." The voice carried the harried tone of someone dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. "We've got a situation developing with our F-16 fleet. 3 aircraft have experienced fuel system anomalies during routine operations this week. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to ground the planes until we can figure out what's causing the problems." Mari's blood ran cold. Fuel system anomalies in multiple aircraft suggested exactly the kind of problem that inferior fuel additives could cause. Gradual degradation of system components that would eventually lead to complete failure. "Captain, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have any of the affected aircraft been scheduled for combat deployment?" All of them, Stevens replied immediately. They're part of Squadron 442, scheduled to deploy to overseas operations next month. Why? Before Pete could answer, his second phone line rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from Base Command. Colonel Harrison's office, according to the caller ID display that had been installed the previous month, as part of a communication upgrade that Pete had documented, requisitioned, and tracked through 6 months of bureaucratic approval processes. "Captain, I need to call you back," Pete said, switching lines with hands that had begun to shake with the implications of what he'd discovered. "Building 127, Staff Sergeant Morgan." "Morgan, this is Colonel Harrison. I need you in my office immediately. Bring everything you've compiled on the fuel system audit." The line went dead before Pete could respond. Colonel Harrison wasn't known for social calls or casual conversation. If he wanted an immediate meeting, it meant the situation had escalated beyond routine administrative review. Pete gathered his analysis, documentation, and evidence of systematic fraud, knowing that the next hour would either validate 4 years of obsessive attention to detail or end his military career in spectacular fashion. As he walked across the base toward the command building, Pete reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him to this moment. 4 years ago, he'd enlisted in the Air Force with dreams of becoming a pilot, convinced that his analytical mind and attention to detail would make him ideal for precision flying. Instead, he discovered during flight training that his greatest strength wasn't his ability to operate aircraft. It was his capacity to understand the complex systems that kept aircraft operational. The irony wasn't lost on him that Paperwork Pete, the administrative specialist that everyone dismissed as a bureaucratic drone, might be the only person on base with the knowledge and documentation necessary to prevent what could become the worst aviation disaster in Air Force history. The question was whether anyone would listen to him before it was too late. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Colonel James Harrison's office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor in the Base Command building, with windows that offered a panoramic view of the flight line where F-16 Fighting Falcons sat in precise rows like sleeping predators. The walls were decorated with commendations, unit photos, and the kind of military memorabilia that spoke of a career built on operational excellence rather than political maneuvering. When Mari entered at precisely 1,615 hours, she found Harrison studying a stack of reports with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that could end careers. At 48, the colonel possessed the weathered competence of a former fighter pilot who'd transitioned to command without losing his understanding of what happened when attention to detail failed at 30,000 feet. "Sit down, Rodriguez," Harrison said without looking up from the documents spread across his desk. "I've been reviewing your preliminary findings on the fuel audit, and I need you to explain something to me." Mari settled into the chair across from Harrison's desk, her folder of evidence feeling suddenly inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd discovered. "Yes, sir. According to your analysis, we've been systematically defrauded by our primary fuel supplier for the past 3 years," Harrison continued, finally looking up with eyes that suggested he'd already drawn conclusions that nobody was going to like. "You're alleging that Master Sergeant Collins in Quality Control has been falsifying inspection reports to hide the fact that we've been paying premium prices for substandard fuel." "That's correct, sir. The documentation shows a clear pattern of—" Harrison held up a hand, cutting her off. "Before you continue, I need you to understand something, Rodriguez. Master Sergeant Collins has been in charge of fuel quality control for 8 years. He's got commendations from 3 different wing commanders, and his inspection protocols have been used as models for other bases. Are you absolutely certain about these allegations?" Mari opened her folder and extracted a series of documents that represented months of meticulous cross-referencing. "Sir, I've compared fuel delivery manifests with quality control reports and payment vouchers. In 23 separate instances over 3 years, we paid invoices for JP-8 aviation fuel with performance additives, but Collins' inspection reports show acceptance of fuel that meets only minimum specifications." She spread the evidence across Harrison's desk with the precision of someone who'd organized it for maximum clarity. "The discrepancies aren't random or occasional. They follow a specific pattern that coincides with deliveries from Apex Petroleum Solutions, our primary contractor." Harrison studied the documents with growing concern. What kind of performance difference are we talking about? "The additives we're paying for include corrosion inhibitors, static dissipator additives, and lubricity improvers that extend engine life and improve performance under combat conditions, Mari explained, warming to the technical details that most people found tediously boring. The fuel we're actually receiving meets basic combustion requirements, but lacks these protective elements. Meaning? Meaning our engines are experiencing accelerated wear, our fuel systems are more susceptible to contamination, and our aircraft performance is degraded compared to specifications, Mari replied. Over time, this kind of substitution could lead to catastrophic failures, especially under the stress of combat operations. Harrison was quiet for several long minutes, processing implications that went far beyond simple procurement fraud. Rodriguez, if you're right about this, we're looking at a conspiracy that involves falsification of official documents, defrauding the government, and potentially compromising pilot safety. That's court-martial territory for everyone involved. Yes, sir. It's also the kind of allegation that could destroy careers even if it turns out to be wrong, Harrison continued, studying Mari with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating whether to trust a subordinate with career-ending information. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Before Mari could answer, Harrison's phone buzzed with the distinctive tone that indicated an urgent call from Wing Command. The colonel answered immediately, his expression growing darker as he listened to whoever was speaking. Understood, sir. Yes, we're already investigating. I'll have a preliminary report within 24 hours. Harrison ended the call and looked at Mari with something approaching grim satisfaction. That was General Patterson from Wing Command. Apparently, 3 other bases have reported similar fuel quality issues, and the Inspector General's office is initiating a formal investigation. Mari felt a mixture of vindication and terror settling in her stomach. Being right about systematic fraud was professionally satisfying, but it also meant she was about to become the primary witness in an investigation that could implicate senior personnel across multiple installations. Sir, there's something else, Mari said, consulting her notes with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. I've been tracking maintenance reports for our F-16 fleet, and there's been a 34% increase in fuel system-related issues over the past 18 months. Nothing catastrophic enough to trigger formal investigations, but a clear pattern of accelerated component wear. Harrison leaned back in his chair, the weight of command responsibility visible in every line of his face. You're telling me that substandard fuel has been degrading our aircraft readiness without anyone noticing? Not without anyone noticing, Mari corrected carefully. The maintenance crews have been documenting the problems and replacing components as they fail. But nobody was analyzing the data to identify systemic patterns because fuel quality wasn't considered a variable. Except you. Yes, sir. Administrative personnel see information from multiple departments that doesn't usually get cross-referenced. I noticed that fuel delivery dates correlated with increased maintenance issues, so I started investigating. Harrison stood and walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where millions of dollars worth of combat aircraft sat ready for missions that could be compromised by the very fuel they depended on. Rodriguez, I need you to understand something. What you've discovered could fundamentally change how the Air Force approaches supply chain security and quality control. It could also make you a lot of enemies among people who've built careers on systems that apparently don't work. Mari had been expecting this conversation since she'd first identified the discrepancies. Military institutions didn't reward subordinates who exposed systemic failures, especially when those failures implicated senior personnel. Sir, I understand the risks, but pilots are depending on fuel quality to bring them home safely. If we don't address this now, people are going to die. Good answer, Harrison said, returning to his desk with the decisiveness of someone who'd made a command decision. I'm assigning you to work directly with the Inspector General's investigation team. You'll have full access to base records and authorization to interview personnel about their knowledge of fuel procurement and quality control procedures. The assignment was simultaneously the opportunity Mari had been hoping for, and everything she'd been dreading. Working with the Inspector General meant her findings would receive serious attention, but it also meant placing herself at the center of an investigation that could end careers and trigger congressional hearings. There's one more thing, Harrison continued, consulting a personnel file that Mari recognized as her own. Your background shows that you originally applied for pilot training but were reassigned to administrative duties. Mind explaining why? Mari had been dreading this question for 4 years. Sir, I passed all the academic requirements and flight aptitude tests, but I was eliminated during advanced training for what was classified as failure to demonstrate command presence under pressure. Meaning? meaning I asked too many questions about procedural inconsistencies and challenged training protocols that seemed to contradict technical manuals. Pete replied, the old frustration creeping into his voice despite his efforts to maintain military bearing. My instructors felt that questioning established procedures indicated a lack of confidence in military authority. Harrison smiled for the first time since Pete had entered his office. So you were eliminated from pilot training for the same analytical thinking that just uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme affecting multiple Air Force installations. Yes, sir. Outstanding. The Air Force's loss in aircrew became our gain in quality control. Harrison made a note in Pete's file. I'm recommending you for accelerated promotion to technical sergeant, with assignment to the new supply chain security office we're establishing in response to this investigation. The promotion would skip Pete past an entire enlisted rank, recognizing his specialized expertise in ways that standard career progression couldn't accommodate. It was validation that his obsessive approach to documentation and analysis had value beyond simple administrative compliance. As Pete gathered his evidence and prepared to leave, Harrison stopped him with a final observation. Morgan, you realize that if you hadn't been eliminated from pilot training, you never would have developed the expertise that led to this discovery? Pete considered the irony that his greatest professional failure had positioned him to prevent what could have been an aviation disaster. Sometimes the system fails in ways that turn out to be lucky, sir. Sometimes, Harrison agreed, but usually it just fails. The trick is having people like you who notice when it does. Walking back across the base toward Building 127, Pete reflected on how quickly his professional circumstances had changed. This morning he'd been Paperwork Pete, the administrative specialist who disappeared into filing cabinets and emerged with miracles. This afternoon he was the key witness in an investigation that could reshape Air Force procurement procedures and potentially save lives across multiple installations. The question was whether his newfound visibility and authority would last long enough to prevent the fuel quality issues from escalating into actual casualties. Because despite Colonel Harrison's support and the Inspector General's investigation, Pete knew that institutional change was slow, and aircraft were scheduled to deploy with potentially compromised fuel systems within weeks. The real test of his analytical abilities was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. The Inspector General's office had transformed Conference Room C into what looked like a war room crossed with a federal courthouse. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with the methodical demeanor of someone who'd built her career on exposing institutional failures, presided over tables covered with evidence boxes, computer terminals, and the kind of documentation that could end careers or send people to federal prison. When Mari entered at 0800 hours the following morning, she found herself face-to-face with an investigation team that included not only Air Force personnel, but also agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and a civilian auditor from the Government Accountability Office. The scope of what she'd uncovered was becoming clear. This wasn't just a base-level problem, but a systematic fraud that potentially affected Air Force operations across multiple theaters. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell said, looking up from a thick folder marked with Mari's name and security classification stamps. I've been reviewing your preliminary findings, and I have to say, your attention to detail is remarkable. Most administrative personnel would have missed these patterns entirely. Mari settled into the chair across from Mitchell, acutely aware that every word she spoke would be recorded, analyzed, and potentially used in court proceedings that could reshape military procurement procedures. Thank you, ma'am. I've always believed that documentation accuracy is critical to operational safety. Indeed. Mitchell consulted her notes with the precision of someone who'd conducted dozens of similar investigations. However, I need to ask you some difficult questions about how you obtained this information. Some of the databases you accessed require security clearances above your current level. The question Mari had been dreading since she'd first started connecting patterns across different information systems. Her analytical work had necessarily involved accessing databases that were technically outside her authorization level, though she'd never deliberately violated security protocols. Ma'am, I used only the systems that my position provides access to. However, I did cross-reference information between databases in ways that may not have been anticipated by the original access protocols. Mitchell nodded, making notes that would either vindicate Mari's methods or trigger additional security investigations. Walk me through your discovery process. I want to understand exactly how you identified these discrepancies. For the next 3 hours, Mari methodically explained her analytical approach, demonstrating how she'd identified patterns that revealed the systematic substitution of inferior fuel. She showed how delivery manifests consistently showed premium fuel specifications while quality control reports documented acceptance of products that met only minimum standards. Most damning, she revealed how payment vouchers proved the Air Force had been charged premium prices for substandard products. The key breakthrough came when I noticed that fuel-related maintenance issues spiked approximately 30 days after deliveries from Apex Petroleum Solutions, Mari explained, pulling up maintenance data on one of the investigation team's computer terminals. The timing suggested that whatever was causing the increased component failures had a delayed effect consistent with cumulative damage from inferior fuel additives. Agent Patricia Walsh from DCIS leaned forward with the intense interest of someone who'd spent years tracking defense contractor fraud. Rodriguez, you're describing a conspiracy that would require coordination between the supplier and base personnel with access to quality control documentation. Do you have evidence of specific individuals involved in falsifying reports? Mari produced a series of documents that she'd been hoping she wouldn't need to use. Ma'am, Master Sergeant Timothy Collins has been signing off on fuel quality reports that contradict the actual specifications of delivered products. Either he's been systematically negligent in his inspections, or he's been deliberately falsifying documentation. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Collins was a 20-year veteran with an exemplary service record and commendations from multiple commands. Accusing him of systematic fraud was the kind of allegation that could destroy not only his career, but Mari's credibility if the evidence wasn't absolutely conclusive. We'll need to interview Collins immediately, Mitchell decided. But first, I want you to walk us through the financial impact of this fraud. How much money are we talking about? Mari consulted her analysis spreadsheets, numbers that she'd calculated and recalculated to ensure accuracy. Based on 3 years of delivery data, the Air Force has overpaid approximately $2.8 million for fuel that didn't meet contracted specifications. However, the operational impact is potentially much more significant. She pulled up maintenance cost data that revealed the true scope of the fraud's consequences. The accelerated component wear caused by inferior fuel has resulted in approximately 340 additional maintenance actions over the past 18 months, with associated costs of $1.6 million in parts and labor. More importantly, we've had 23 mission cancellations due to fuel system anomalies that can be directly attributed to substandard fuel quality. The civilian auditor, a thin man named David Chen who'd been quietly taking notes throughout the morning, looked up with the expression of someone who just calculated figures that nobody was going to like. So we're looking at direct financial damages of over $4.4 million, plus operational impacts that are difficult to quantify? That's just for this base, Mari replied. If the pattern holds across other installations, we could be looking at tens of millions in damages and potentially hundreds of compromised missions. Agent Walsh stood and began pacing with the restless energy of someone who'd identified a target for investigation. Rodriguez, I need you to understand something. What you've uncovered isn't just procurement fraud. It's potential sabotage of military readiness. If aircraft have been compromised by inferior fuel during combat operations, we're looking at charges that could include endangering national security. The weight of that statement settled on Mari's shoulders like a lead vest. She'd started this investigation as a routine audit request and discovered what amounted to systematic undermining of Air Force capabilities. The knowledge that her findings could trigger criminal investigations affecting dozens of people was both vindicating and terrifying. There's something else, Mari said, consulting notes that she'd been reluctant to share until she was certain of their implications. I've been tracking fuel delivery patterns, and there's a suspicious correlation between Apex Petroleum deliveries and inspection schedules that suggest advanced knowledge of quality control procedures. She produced a timeline that showed how Apex consistently delivered substandard fuel during periods when backup quality control personnel were conducting inspections, suggesting either remarkable coincidence or inside information about inspection schedules. The timing is too precise to be accidental. Someone has been providing Apex with information about when regular quality control protocols would be relaxed. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell studied the timeline with growing concern. You're suggesting that not only has Collins been falsifying reports, but someone has been providing Apex with inside information to maximize their opportunities for fraud. Yes, ma'am, the pattern suggests coordination between Apex and multiple base personnel who have access to inspection schedules and quality control procedures. The investigation team exchanged glances that suggested Mari's discovery had just expanded from a simple fraud case to a potential conspiracy involving multiple military personnel and civilian contractors. Agent Walsh was already pulling out her phone to contact additional DCIS investigators. "Rodriguez," Mitchell said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who just realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. "I'm placing you under protective administrative status pending completion of this investigation. You'll continue working with our team, but you're not to discuss these findings with anyone outside this room without my explicit authorization." Protective administrative status was military bureaucracy's way of shielding key witnesses from retaliation while ensuring their continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. It meant Mari's access to normal base operations would be restricted, but it also meant her findings were being taken seriously at the highest levels. "There's one more thing I need to ask," Mitchell continued, consulting Mari's personnel file. "Your background shows exceptional analytical abilities that led to this discovery. Have you considered that your reassignment from pilot training to administrative duties might not have been coincidental?" The question hit Mari like a punch to the stomach. She'd always assumed her elimination from pilot training was the result of institutional bias against women who asked too many questions. The possibility that it had been deliberate maneuvering to place her in a position where her analytical skills could be utilized for specific purposes was something she'd never considered. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand the implication. I'm suggesting that someone recognized your abilities and ensured you were placed in a position where you could identify exactly the kind of systematic problems you've uncovered," Mitchell explained. "The question is whether that placement was designed to help or hinder Air Force interests." As the morning briefing concluded and the investigation team began planning their next steps, Mari found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her military career. Her failure in pilot training, her assignment to Building 127, even Captain Thompson's unusual requests for comprehensive audits. All of it could have been part of a larger plan to either expose or conceal systematic fraud affecting Air Force operations. The one thing she knew for certain was that in less than 48 hours, her quiet existence as Paperwork Mari had become the center of an investigation that could reshape military procurement procedures and potentially send people to federal prison. Whether that transformation would ultimately serve Air Force interests or destroy her military career remained to be seen. But as she walked back to Building 127 under the supervision of DCIS agents who would now be monitoring her every move, Mari realized that she'd crossed a line from which there was no return. The documentation she'd compiled wasn't just evidence of fraud, it was ammunition in a war against institutional corruption that could either validate everything she'd worked for or destroy everything she'd built. The real battle was just beginning. The fuel storage facility at Whitmore Air Force Base occupied 12 acres of concrete and steel on the eastern perimeter, where massive tanks held millions of gallons of JP-8 aviation fuel that kept the base's F-16 fleet operational. At 1,430 hours on Thursday afternoon, Mari found herself walking through this industrial maze alongside Agent Walsh and Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, heading toward a confrontation that would either validate months of investigation or destroy the credibility she'd spent 4 years building. Master Sergeant Timothy Collins was waiting for them in Quality Control Station 3, a cramped office filled with testing equipment, sample containers, and filing cabinets containing 3 years of fuel inspection reports that would either prove his innocence or confirm his participation in systematic fraud. At 44, Collins possessed the weathered competence of a career NCO who'd built his reputation on technical expertise and unwavering attention to detail. "Master Sergeant Collins," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell began, settling into a chair across from his desk, while Agent Walsh positioned herself near the door with the casual alertness of someone prepared for any response. "We're conducting a formal investigation into fuel quality discrepancies identified by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I need to ask you some questions about your inspection procedures." Collins glanced at Mari with an expression that mixed confusion with something that might have been disappointment. "Ma'am, if this is about fuel quality, I can assure you that my inspection protocols exceed Air Force standards." Every delivery is tested for octane rating, additive content, and contamination levels before acceptance. Mari opened her folder and extracted the first piece of evidence that would either vindicate or destroy Collins' 20-year career. Master Sergeant, on March 15th, you signed an inspection report accepting 50,000 gallons of JP8 fuel from Apex Petroleum Solutions. Your report indicates the fuel met all specifications for corrosion inhibitors and static dissipator additives. She placed the document on Collins' desk with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. However, the delivery manifest shows that Apex delivered standard JP8 without premium additives, and our payment records show we were charged the premium rate. Collins studied the documents with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that could determine his professional future. Rodriguez, I tested that delivery personally. The fuel met all required specifications. According to what testing procedure? Agent Walsh interjected, consulting notes that indicated she'd spent considerable time reviewing Air Force quality control protocols. Because the equipment in this facility isn't calibrated to detect the specific additives listed in your acceptance report. The statement hung in the air like fuel vapor. Invisible but potentially explosive. Collins' face went pale as he realized the implications of what Walsh was suggesting. If his testing equipment couldn't detect the additives he'd certified as present, then either his procedures were fundamentally flawed or he'd been deliberately falsifying reports. Agent Walsh, I need to see the calibration records for all testing equipment in this facility, Mitchell commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd conducted enough investigations to recognize the moment when evidence and testimony diverged. Collins produced a series of maintenance records that documented regular calibration of basic fuel testing equipment, instruments capable of measuring octane ratings and detecting major contaminants, but not sophisticated enough to identify the presence or absence of specific performance additives that distinguished premium fuel from standard products. Master Sergeant, Mari said quietly, feeling no satisfaction in the revelation that was about to destroy a career, the additives you've been certifying as present require spectroscopic analysis that this facility isn't equipped to perform. How have you been confirming their presence? Collins was quiet for several long minutes, staring at testing equipment that he'd operated for 8 years without fully understanding its limitations. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the defeated tone of someone who'd just realized the magnitude of his professional failure. I've been relying on supplier certifications, he admitted. When Apex provided documentation showing that deliveries contained the specified additives, I accepted their word and conducted only the tests that our equipment could perform. Agent Walsh leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd just identified the critical weakness in a defense contractor fraud scheme. Collins, you've been signing government documents, certifying tests that you never actually performed, based on certifications provided by the same company that was defrauding the government? I didn't know it was fraud, Collins replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Apex has been our primary fuel supplier for 5 years. Their reputation in the industry is excellent, and their documentation always indicated compliance with contract specifications. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stood and began pacing with the restless energy of someone processing implications that went far beyond simple negligence. Master Sergeant, you're telling me that for 3 years you've been accepting supplier certifications without independent verification of premium fuel additives that the Air Force was paying millions of dollars to receive? Yes, ma'am. The admission transformed the investigation from potential fraud to confirmed institutional failure. Collins hadn't been deliberately falsifying reports. He'd been systematically accepting false certifications because the Air Force had placed him in a position to certify products using equipment that couldn't perform the required tests. There's something else, Mari said, consulting her notes with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. Master Sergeant Collins, I've identified 23 instances over 3 years where you accepted deliveries during periods when backup personnel were scheduled to conduct inspections. Did Apex have advanced knowledge of when regular quality control procedures would be modified? Collins' expression shifted from defeat to confusion. Rodriguez, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Backup inspection schedules are administrative matters that suppliers wouldn't have access to. Agent Walsh produced a timeline that Mari had compiled showing the correlation between Apex deliveries and backup inspection periods. Collins, this pattern suggests either remarkable coincidence or that someone was providing Apex with inside information about when quality control procedures would be relaxed. That's impossible, Collins protested, studying the timeline with growing alarm. Inspection schedules are internal base operations. Suppliers receive delivery windows but not specific information about personnel assignments or procedure modifications. Mari felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the fuel storage facility. Collins' genuine confusion about the scheduling correlation suggested that while he'd been negligent in his testing procedures, he hadn't been actively collaborating with Apex to defraud the government. Someone else had been providing the supplier with inside information. Master Sergeant, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd just realized the investigation was more complex than initially suspected, I need you to provide us with a complete list of everyone who has access to quality control schedules and inspection procedures. Lesk. Collins consulted his administrative files with the mechanical precision of someone trying to cooperate fully with an investigation that was rapidly expanding beyond his understanding. Ma'am, that would include myself, Captain Thompson, who supervises administrative coordination, Master Sergeant Williams from logistics, and Colonel Harrison's office, which receives all operational scheduling reports. The list included some of the most respected personnel on the base, officers and NCOs whose careers had been built on competence and integrity. The possibility that one of them had been providing information to enable systematic fraud was something that nobody wanted to contemplate. Agent Walsh, Mitchell decided, we need to expand this investigation to include anyone with access to inspection scheduling information. We're looking at potential conspiracy involving multiple base personnel. As the interview concluded, and Collins was placed on administrative leave, pending completion of the investigation, Mari found herself walking back through the fuel storage facility with a growing sense that her discovery had opened a door that nobody could close. What had started as a routine audit had become evidence of institutional failure that could trigger congressional hearings and reshape Air Force procurement procedures. Rodriguez, Agent Walsh said as they reached the parking area outside the fuel storage facility, I need to ask you something directly. Your analysis identified patterns that trained investigators with years of experience might have missed. Where did you learn to recognize this kind of systematic fraud? Mari had been anticipating this question since the investigation began. Agent Walsh, I didn't learn to recognize fraud. I learned to recognize inconsistencies in documentation systems. The fraud was just what the inconsistencies revealed when I started asking questions about why the data didn't match. That's exactly what concerns me, Walsh replied. You've demonstrated analytical abilities that go far beyond standard administrative training. Someone taught you to think like an investigator, and I want to know who and why. As they drove back toward the base command center, Mari reflected on Agent Walsh's observation. Her approach to documentation analysis had been shaped by 4 years of meticulous attention to detail, but the underlying methodology seemed almost instinctive, as if she'd been trained for exactly this kind of discovery without realizing it. The question was whether her analytical abilities were natural talent enhanced by experience, or whether someone had deliberately prepared her to uncover exactly the kind of systematic problems she'd identified. Either way, the investigation that had started with fuel quality discrepancies was revealing institutional failures that could affect Air Force operations across multiple commands. And Mari was beginning to suspect that her role in exposing those failures wasn't as accidental as she'd originally believed. The secure communications room in Building 89 was where Whitmore Air Force Base conducted its most sensitive operations, a windowless chamber lined with equipment that could intercept, analyze, and decrypt communications from hostile forces. At 0530 hours on Friday morning, Mari found herself in this electronic nerve center alongside a team of Air Force intelligence specialists who'd arrived overnight with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Captain Jennifer Hayes, a communications intelligence officer with the kind of technical expertise that made computer systems confess their secrets, was hunched over a terminal displaying data streams that looked like digital hieroglyphics to most observers. But Mari recognized the patterns. They were communication logs that could reveal who had been sharing information with whom and when. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Captain Hayes said without looking up from her screens, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell briefed me on your investigation. We're looking for evidence of unauthorized communications between base personnel and Apex Petroleum Solutions. Your timeline suggests coordination that would require regular information exchange. Mari settled into a chair beside Hayes, watching data scroll past at speeds that challenged human comprehension. Captain, the pattern of deliveries coinciding with backup inspection schedules is too precise to be coincidental. Someone has been providing Apex with advance notice of when quality control procedures would be relaxed. Exactly what we're looking for, Hayes replied, her fingers flying across a keyboard that controlled surveillance systems Mari didn't know existed. However, if someone has been sharing classified information with defense contractors, they probably weren't using official communication channels. For the next 3 hours, Hayes walked Mari through the digital archaeology of base communications, analyzing phone logs, email metadata, and network access records that revealed the hidden patterns of information flow that most people never considered. Every phone call, every email, every database query left electronic fingerprints that could be assembled into comprehensive pictures of who knew what, when they knew it, and how they'd shared that knowledge. There, Hayes said suddenly, highlighting a series of communication records that showed an unusual pattern. Someone has been making regular calls to a number registered to Apex Petroleum Solutions from the base landline system. The calls consistently occur 24 to 48 hours before scheduled fuel deliveries. Mari studied the data with growing excitement and dread. Can you identify who was making the calls? Hayes consulted additional screens that displayed location data for internal phone systems. The calls originated from Building 127. Mari's stomach dropped. Building 127 was her workspace, the administrative center where she'd spent 4 years compiling the very documentation that had exposed the fraud scheme. Someone had been using her building, possibly her own phone system, to coordinate with the suppliers they were defrauding the government. Captain, Building 127 houses multiple administrative offices. Can you narrow down the specific location? Hayes manipulated her displays with the precision of someone who'd spent years extracting secrets from electronic systems. The calls were made from extension 4472. According to base records, that's assigned to Captain Rebecca Thompson's office. The revelation hit Mari like a physical blow. Captain Thompson, the officer who'd treated her with professional respect, who'd assigned her the fuel audit that had uncovered the fraud, who'd seemed genuinely interested in her analytical abilities, had potentially been coordinating with Apex Petroleum to defraud the Air Force. There's more, Hayes continued, highlighting additional communication records. Thompson has been making these calls for over 2 years, always preceding Apex deliveries, and always during periods when backup quality control personnel were scheduled for inspections. Mari felt the pieces of a conspiracy falling into place with the inexorable logic of a well-designed machine. Thompson had access to inspection schedules through her administrative coordination responsibilities. She'd been perfectly positioned to provide Apex with advance notice of when regular quality control procedures would be relaxed, enabling them to deliver substandard fuel during periods when detection would be least likely. Captain Hayes, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, Mari said, her voice tight with implications she didn't want to consider. Captain Thompson assigned me the fuel audit that uncovered this fraud. Is it possible that she was setting me up to discover the very conspiracy she was participating in? Hayes was quiet for several moments, processing the complexity of what Mari was suggesting. Rodriguez, you're asking whether Thompson deliberately exposed her own criminal activity by assigning you to investigate it. That would be either remarkably stupid or remarkably clever. How would it be clever? If Thompson suspected that the fraud was about to be discovered anyway, she could position herself as the officer who initiated the investigation, Hayes explained, warming to the strategic implications of the scenario. By assigning you to conduct the audit, she could claim credit for uncovering the fraud while simultaneously distancing herself from the criminal activity. The possibility that Mari had been manipulated into exposing a conspiracy by someone who was part of that conspiracy was something she'd never considered. Her analytical work, her meticulous documentation, even her discovery of the fraud patterns, all of it could have been orchestrated by someone who needed a credible witness to validate evidence of crimes they'd committed. There's something else, Hayes said, consulting additional data streams that revealed even more disturbing patterns. Thompson has been accessing your administrative databases after hours, including periods when you weren't on base. She's been monitoring your analytical work and possibly modifying records you've been using for your investigations. As the morning briefing concluded and Mari prepared to share these discoveries with Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and Agent Walsh, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her professional relationships and career trajectory. Captain Thompson hadn't just been her supervisor. She'd potentially been managing Mari's access to information in ways that served her own criminal interests. The secure communications room felt suddenly claustrophobic as Mari realized that her greatest professional achievement, uncovering systematic fraud that could reshape Air Force procurement procedures, might have been orchestrated by the very person who'd been perpetrating that fraud. "Rodriguez," Captain Hayes said as they prepared to leave the communications center, "I've been analyzing your database access patterns over the past 4 years, and there's something you need to know. Your analytical work has been remarkably prescient. You've consistently identified problems before they became critical issues. That level of analytical success is either natural genius or careful preparation. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that someone has been ensuring you had access to exactly the information you needed to become exceptionally good at your job," Hayes explained. "Your database permissions, your assignment requests, even your work schedules have been modified in ways that maximized your exposure to patterns that most administrative personnel would never see." Mari felt the weight of 4 years of professional development settling on her shoulders with new and disturbing implications. Her analytical abilities, her reputation for finding solutions to impossible problems, her assignment to the fuel audit that had uncovered systematic fraud, all of it could have been the result of careful manipulation by someone who needed her skills for purposes she'd never understood. "Captain, if Thompson has been manipulating my career development for 2 years, what was she preparing me to discover?" Hayes consulted her analysis with the expression of someone who'd uncovered a puzzle that nobody was going to like solving. "Based on the patterns, she was preparing you to uncover exactly what you uncovered: systematic fraud involving fuel quality and supplier relationships. The question is whether she was preparing you to expose that fraud or to validate a carefully constructed narrative that would protect her from prosecution." As they walked back toward the base command center where Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell and Agent Walsh were waiting for their report, Mari realized that her investigation had evolved from simple fraud detection to something approaching espionage analysis. The question was no longer just who had been defrauding the Air Force, but who had been manipulating the investigation of that fraud and why. The answer to those questions would either validate everything she'd accomplished or reveal that her greatest professional achievement had been nothing more than sophisticated manipulation by someone who'd been using her analytical abilities to serve their own criminal purposes. Either way, the confrontation with Captain Thompson was going to determine not just the future of the investigation, but the future of Mari's military career and her understanding of everything she'd worked to accomplish. The base chapel at Whitmore Air Force Base was an unlikely venue for a criminal interrogation, but Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had chosen it specifically because Captain Thompson had been attending morning services there for the past 3 years. At 0630 hours on Saturday morning, as Thompson knelt in prayer in the empty sanctuary, she was surrounded by federal agents who'd been waiting for her arrival with the patience of people who understood that some conversations required careful staging. Mari watched from the chapel entrance as Agent Walsh approached Thompson with the kind of measured calm that suggested years of experience in confronting suspects who'd built their lives on carefully constructed lies. The morning light streaming through stained glass windows created an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed inappropriate for what was about to unfold. "Captain Thompson," Agent Walsh said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to ensure immediate attention without disrupting the sacred atmosphere. "We need to speak with you about your communications with Apex Petroleum Solutions." Thompson looked up from her prayers with an expression that shifted from surprise to resignation so quickly that Mari almost missed the transition. In that moment, Mari realized that Thompson had been expecting this confrontation possibly for months. "I suppose this is about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's investigation," Thompson said, rising from the pew with the dignity of someone who decided to face consequences rather than continue running from them. "I've been wondering when someone would connect the patterns she identified to my administrative responsibilities." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stepped forward from her position near the altar, her voice echoing slightly in the vaulted space. "Captain, you're under investigation for conspiracy to defraud the United States government and providing classified information to defense contractors. I'm going to read you your rights, and then we're going to have a very detailed conversation about your relationship with Apex Petroleum." As Mitchell recited the Miranda warnings in the hushed atmosphere of the chapel, Mari found herself studying Thompson's face for signs of the deception that had apparently shaped their entire professional relationship. But instead of guilt or fear, she saw something that looked disturbingly like relief. "Before we continue," Thompson said once Mitchell had finished the formal warnings, "I need to explain something about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's role in this investigation. She's been manipulated, but not in the way you think. Agent Walsh consulted her notes with the expression of someone prepared for any defensive strategy. Captain, we have communication records showing regular contact between you and Apex Petroleum over a 2-year period. We have evidence that you've been accessing Rodriguez's databases and monitoring her analytical work. Are you claiming that wasn't conspiracy to defraud the government? I'm claiming it was conspiracy to expose fraud, not perpetrate it, Thompson replied, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd finally decided to tell a truth she'd been concealing for years. Agent Walsh, I've been working undercover for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations for the past 3 years. The statement hit the chapel like a sonic boom, reverberating off stone walls and challenging everything Mari thought she understood about the investigation. Thompson wasn't a criminal. She was an undercover investigator who'd been posing as a criminal to expose systematic fraud affecting multiple Air Force installations. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell pulled out her phone and made a call that would either validate Thompson's claim or confirm her desperation. This is Mitchell. I need immediate verification of OSI operation designation. Yes, I'll hold. During the tense silence that followed, Thompson turned to face Mari directly. Rodriguez, I need you to understand something. Your analytical abilities aren't the result of manipulation. They're genuine talent that I've been protecting and nurturing, because the Air Force needs people like you to identify problems that trained investigators might miss. Mari felt her understanding of the past 4 years shifting once again, like pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves into completely different pictures. Captain, are you telling me that everything I discovered was part of an investigation you were already conducting? I'm telling you that your discoveries validated intelligence we'd been developing for 3 years, Thompson replied. OSI suspected systematic fraud involving multiple suppliers and base personnel, but we needed independent analysis from someone with legitimate access to administrative systems. Your work provided the documentation we needed to build prosecutable cases. Agent Walsh studied Thompson with the skeptical attention of someone who'd heard elaborate stories from suspects trying to avoid prosecution. Captain, if you're really OSI, why didn't you identify yourself when our investigation began? Because OSI operations require compartmentalized security, Thompson explained. Even DCIS wasn't briefed on our investigation until your findings confirmed our intelligence about Apex Petroleum and other defense contractors involved in systematic fraud. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's phone buzzed with the incoming call that would either validate or destroy Thompson's credibility. She listened for several minutes, her expression revealing nothing about the information she was receiving. When she finally ended the call, her voice carried the weight of someone who just learned that nothing was what it seemed. Captain Thompson is assigned to OSI Operation Silent Ledger, a 3-year investigation into defense contractor fraud affecting multiple Air Force installations, Mitchell announced. Her cover assignment to administrative coordination at this base was specifically designed to monitor fuel procurement procedures and identify personnel involved in systematic fraud. Mari felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as the implications became clear. Ma'am, if Captain Thompson is OSI, then Master Sergeant Collins. Collins is exactly what he appears to be, an incompetent NCO who was accepting supplier certifications without proper verification, Thompson replied. But he wasn't the target of our investigation. We were tracking the network of defense contractors and base personnel who were exploiting his incompetence to defraud the government. Agent Walsh consulted her investigation files with the expression of someone trying to understand how a DCIS investigation had intersected with an ongoing OSI operation. Thompson, why wasn't DCIS briefed on your operation before we initiated our investigation? Because your investigation was triggered by Rodriguez's independent analysis, Thompson explained. I couldn't predict when or how she would identify the fraud patterns we'd been tracking. When she uncovered evidence that validated our intelligence, we had to let your investigation proceed naturally to preserve the integrity of both operations. The complexity of what had been happening at Whitmore Air Force Base was becoming clear. Mari's analytical work hadn't been manipulated. It had been protected and encouraged because it was providing independent validation of intelligence that OSI had been developing through undercover operations. Her discoveries weren't the result of manipulation, but rather the product of genuine analytical ability applied to systems that multiple organizations were investigating simultaneously. Rodriguez, Thompson said, turning back to Mari with an expression that mixed professional respect with something approaching maternal pride, I need you to understand something about your career development. You weren't assigned to Building 127 because someone wanted to hide your abilities. You were assigned there because the Air Force recognized that your analytical skills could identify systematic problems that traditional investigation methods might miss. Mari felt 4 years of self-doubt and professional uncertainty beginning to resolve into understanding. "Captain, my elimination from pilot training was legitimate," Thompson replied firmly. "You were eliminated because your analytical thinking made your instructors uncomfortable, but that same analytical thinking made you perfect for identifying patterns in administrative systems. I didn't orchestrate your career path. We just recognized its value when your work started identifying problems we'd been investigating." As the morning briefing concluded and the various investigation teams began coordinating their activities, Mari found herself walking back across the base with a completely different understanding of her professional identity and capabilities. She wasn't Paperwork Mari, the failed pilot candidate who'd been relegated to administrative duties. She was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the analytical specialist whose independent discoveries had validated a multi-year investigation into defense contractor fraud. "Rodriguez," Agent Walsh said as they approached Building 127, "I have one more question about your analytical work. Your methods for identifying fraud patterns are remarkably sophisticated for someone with standard administrative training. Where did you learn those techniques?" Mari considered the question that had been bothering her since the investigation began. "Agent Walsh, I think I've been learning those techniques through 4 years of trying to understand why documentation systems didn't make sense. Captain Thompson didn't teach me to be an investigator. She just gave me access to enough information to discover that I already was one." The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest professional achievement, uncovering systematic fraud that would reshape Air Force procurement procedures, had been accomplished not through manipulation or training, but through the simple application of analytical abilities that she'd possessed all along. The question now was what the Air Force would do with those abilities once the investigation was complete. The emergency klaxon that shattered the pre-dawn silence at Whitmore Air Force Base at 0347 hours on Monday morning wasn't part of any scheduled drill. Mari jolted awake in her quarters, muscle memory immediately recognizing the specific pattern of blasts that meant imminent danger to base operations. As she pulled on her uniform in the darkness, her mind was already racing through the possibilities, and none of them were good. Squadron 442 was scheduled to begin their overseas deployment in less than 6 hours. 47 pilots and crew members who'd been preparing for months to take their F-16 Fighting Falcons into combat zones where fuel system failures could mean death. The same aircraft that had been running on potentially compromised fuel for the past 3 years. Mari's phone rang before she'd finished lacing her boots. Captain Thompson's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone coordinating multiple crises simultaneously. "Rodriguez, we have a situation developing on the flight line. Get to Building 127 immediately and bring everything, every file, every analysis, every piece of documentation related to fuel quality. Lives depend on it." The drive across the base revealed chaos barely contained by military discipline. Emergency vehicles lined the flight line where ground crews were conducting frantic pre-flight inspections on aircraft that were supposed to have been mission-ready hours ago. Red warning lights flashed from the control tower, indicating that all flight operations had been suspended pending resolution of whatever crisis had triggered the emergency protocols. Building 127 was buzzing with activity that Mari had never seen before. Officers from multiple commands were coordinating with technicians, investigators, and personnel whose uniforms she didn't recognize but whose authority was unmistakable. In the center of this controlled chaos, Colonel Harrison was studying computer displays that showed maintenance data scrolling past in real time. "Rodriguez," Harrison called out when he spotted her entering with her files. "We need your analytical expertise immediately. 3 aircraft from Squadron 442 have experienced fuel system anomalies during pre-deployment inspections. Anomalies that could indicate catastrophic failures if those planes had taken off as scheduled." Mari felt her blood turn cold. The fuel quality issues she'd identified weren't just abstract procurement fraud. They were active threats to pilot safety that had nearly resulted in disaster. "Sir, what kind of anomalies?" Major Patricia Davis, the squadron's maintenance officer, pulled up diagnostic data that painted a terrifying picture. Fuel injection systems showing irregular pressure readings, pump mechanisms exhibiting accelerated wear patterns, and filter assemblies clogged with contamination that shouldn't exist in properly refined aviation fuel. Mari studied the maintenance data with growing horror. Every anomaly Davis described was consistent with the degradation patterns that inferior fuel additives would cause over time. The substandard fuel that Apex Petroleum had been delivering hadn't just cheated the government out of money. It had been systematically destroying aircraft engines in ways that could lead to catastrophic in-flight failures. Major Davis, how many aircraft in Squadron 442 have been affected by these fuel system issues? Davis consulted her maintenance logs with the expression of someone who'd been hoping the answer would be better than she knew it was. 17 aircraft showing various degrees of fuel system degradation. 3 are grounded indefinitely pending complete engine overhauls. The others are marginally airworthy for training operations, but shouldn't be deployed for combat missions. Colonel Harrison turned to face Mari directly. Rodriguez, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be absolutely certain of your answer. Based on your analysis of fuel quality discrepancies, are we looking at systematic sabotage of Air Force combat readiness? The question hung in the air like fuel vapor, invisible but potentially explosive. Mari had spent months analyzing data patterns and identifying procurement fraud, but she'd never considered the possibility that inferior fuel delivery was deliberate sabotage rather than simple criminal profiteering. Sir, the pattern of substandard fuel deliveries coinciding with backup inspection schedules suggests coordination that goes beyond random fraud, Mari replied, her voice steady despite the implications of what she was saying. Someone has been systematically ensuring that our aircraft receive inferior fuel during periods when detection would be least likely. Agent Walsh, who'd been monitoring radio communications with federal agencies, looked up from her equipment with an expression that suggested the crisis was expanding beyond base-level concerns. Colonel, I just received word from DCIS headquarters. Similar fuel system anomalies have been reported at 4 other Air Force installations with deployments scheduled this week. We're looking at potential systematic sabotage affecting multiple combat squadrons. The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clear. This wasn't just fraud affecting one base. It was a coordinated attack on Air Force combat readiness that could have compromised military operations across multiple theaters. If Squadron 442 had deployed with compromised fuel systems, they could have experienced catastrophic failures during combat missions where mechanical support wasn't available. Rodriguez, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command decisions that could affect national security, I need you to analyze all fuel delivery data for the past 6 months and identify every installation that might have been affected. We need to know how extensive this sabotage operation has been. Mari began pulling files from her meticulously organized system, cross-referencing delivery schedules with maintenance reports from bases across the country. The analysis that had started as a routine audit was becoming an emergency assessment of Air Force combat readiness that could determine whether ongoing military operations had been compromised. Sir, based on delivery patterns and maintenance correlations, I'm seeing similar issues at Nellis, Eglin, Luke, and Langley, Mari reported, her fingers flying across her keyboard as data patterns revealed the scope of the sabotage. Every installation with recent combat deployments has experienced increased fuel system maintenance issues following deliveries from Apex Petroleum or their subsidiary contractors. Captain Thompson, still coordinating between OSI and base operations, approached with radio traffic that indicated the crisis was escalating beyond anything they'd anticipated. Colonel, Pentagon is directing immediate inspection of all aircraft scheduled for deployment this week. We're looking at potential delays of combat operations while fuel systems are evaluated and repaired. The implications were staggering. If multiple combat squadrons had been compromised by systematic fuel sabotage, the Air Force's ability to conduct ongoing operations could be severely degraded. Mari's discovery of procurement fraud had revealed what amounted to an attack on national defense capabilities. There's something else, Mari said, studying fuel delivery schedules that revealed a pattern she'd never noticed before. The timing of substandard fuel deliveries correlates with increased geopolitical tensions in regions where these squadrons were scheduled to deploy. Someone has been systematically degrading our combat readiness during periods when we're most likely to need those capabilities. Major Davis pulled up deployment schedules that confirmed Mari's analysis. Rodriguez is right. Every squadron affected by fuel system issues was scheduled for deployment to areas with active military operations or emerging security threats. Agent Walsh was already coordinating with federal agencies to trace the origins of what was looking less like simple fraud and more like systematic sabotage by hostile forces. Colonel, DCIS is initiating a national security investigation. If foreign agents have been using defense contractor relationships to sabotage Air Force combat readiness, we're looking at potential acts of war. As emergency protocols activated across multiple Air Force installations and investigators began tracing connections between fuel suppliers and potential foreign intelligence operations, Mari found herself at the center of a crisis that had grown far beyond anything she'd imagined when she'd started analyzing procurement discrepancies. The morning sun was rising over a base where 47 pilots who should have been flying combat missions were instead watching their aircraft undergo emergency inspections for fuel system damage that could have killed them. Squadron 442's deployment was indefinitely postponed while investigators determined whether their aircraft had been sabotaged by enemies who understood that the most effective way to defeat the Air Force wasn't to shoot down planes, it was to ensure they never got off the ground. Rodriguez, Colonel Harrison said as the Crisis Coordination Center buzzed with activity that would determine the scope of America's military response to systematic sabotage. Your analytical work may have just prevented the worst aviation disaster in Air Force history. More importantly, you may have exposed an attack on our national defense that we never saw coming. Mari looked out at the flight line where millions of dollars worth of combat aircraft sat grounded by fuel system damage that her investigation had finally identified. Her 4 years of meticulous documentation and pattern analysis had culminated in a moment where paperwork Mari had literally saved the lives of every pilot on the base. The question now was whether her discoveries had come soon enough to prevent similar sabotage from affecting Air Force operations around the world. 6 months after the emergency that had grounded Squadron 442 and triggered a Pentagon-level investigation into systematic sabotage of Air Force combat readiness, Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood in the briefing room of the newly established Defense Supply Chain Security Center at Whitmore Air Force Base. The facility that had been built specifically around her analytical capabilities represented everything she'd never dared to dream during those lonely years in Building 127. The morning briefing was attended by officers from across the Air Force, representatives from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and civilian contractors whose expertise in supply chain analysis complemented Mari's pattern recognition abilities. What had started as a routine fuel audit had evolved into a comprehensive defense against systematic sabotage that could affect every aspect of military operations. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Harrison began, addressing the assembled team that now reported directly to Pentagon leadership. I want to review what we've accomplished since Technical Sergeant Rodriguez's initial discovery of fuel quality discrepancies led to exposure of the largest defense contractor sabotage operation in modern military history. The numbers displayed on the briefing room screens told a story that still amazed Mari. The investigation triggered by her fuel audit had identified systematic sabotage affecting 23 Air Force installations, 8 Navy facilities, and 12 Army bases across the continental United States. Over 200 aircraft had been grounded for fuel system repairs, preventing what defense analysts estimated could have been 50 to 75 catastrophic failures during combat operations. Apex Petroleum Solutions and 14 subsidiary companies have been identified as front operations for a foreign intelligence service that spent 5 years infiltrating American defense contractors, Agent Walsh reported, consulting files that documented one of the most sophisticated sabotage operations ever discovered. Their systematic delivery of substandard fuel was designed to degrade combat readiness while remaining below the threshold of detection by standard quality control procedures. Mari studied the evidence with the same analytical precision that had uncovered the original fraud, but now her perspective was shaped by 6 months of understanding the strategic implications of what she'd discovered. The foreign agents hadn't been trying to steal military secrets. They'd been systematically weakening America's ability to project military power by ensuring that aircraft would fail during critical missions. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Harrison said, turning attention to Mari with the kind of professional respect that still felt surreal after years of dismissal. Your analytical methodology has been adopted as the standard for defense supply chain security across all military branches. Can you brief us on the current threat assessment? Mari approached the podium with confidence that had been built through 6 months of briefing senior officers, congressional committees, and intelligence agencies on the techniques that had exposed systematic sabotage. The woman who'd once been dismissed as paperwork Mari was now recognized as one of the military's foremost experts on defense contractor security. Based on our expanded analysis, we've identified 47 additional suppliers whose delivery patterns suggest potential compromise by foreign intelligence services, Mari reported, displaying data that represented months of coordinated investigation by teams across multiple agencies. However, our enhanced monitoring systems are now detecting these anomalies in real time rather than years after the fact. The Defense Supply Chain Security Center that had been built around Mari's capabilities employed 200 specialists who used her analytical methods to monitor procurement activities across the entire defense industrial base. Every fuel delivery, every parts shipment, every contractor relationship was now subject to the kind of pattern analysis that had identified the Apex Petroleum sabotage operation. The prevention systems we've implemented have already identified and prevented 6 additional sabotage attempts, Mari continued, displaying evidence of supply chain security threats that would have gone undetected under previous procedures. Foreign intelligence services are still attempting to infiltrate defense contractors, but our enhanced analytical capabilities are making those operations significantly more difficult to sustain. Major General Patricia Stevens, who'd flown in from Pentagon headquarters specifically for this briefing, studied the threat assessment data with the focused attention of someone responsible for national defense policy. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, your work has fundamentally changed how the Department of Defense approaches supply chain security. I understand you've been offered a direct commission to captain and assignment to the Pentagon staff. The offer was everything Mari had never thought to want: a rapid promotion to officer status, assignment to the highest levels of military leadership, and responsibility for defense programs that could affect global security. It was vindication beyond anything she'd imagined during those years of being dismissed as a bureaucratic administrator who asked too many questions. Yes, ma'am, I've been offered the commission, Mari replied. However, I've also been offered the opportunity to remain here at Whitmore and continue developing the analytical methods that exposed this sabotage operation. I believe my abilities can serve the Air Force best by continuing to identify patterns that others might miss. General Stevens nodded with understanding that suggested she'd faced similar career decisions. Rodriguez, you've proven that some of our most valuable assets aren't the people who fly the aircraft or command the operations, but the people who ensure that those aircraft and operations have the support they need to succeed. Your choice to focus on analytical work rather than traditional leadership roles demonstrates understanding of where your talents can make the greatest impact. As the briefing concluded, and the various agencies began coordinating their ongoing investigations, Mari found herself reflecting on the transformation that had brought her from Building 127 to briefing rooms where generals sought her analytical assessment of national security threats. Captain Thompson, whose OSI operation had provided the intelligence framework for Mari's discoveries, approached as the room cleared. Rodriguez, I wanted to tell you something before you make your final decision about the Pentagon assignment. Your analytical work didn't just expose one sabotage operation. It created a new model for defense intelligence that's being studied by allies around the world. Mari considered Thompson's observation while looking out at the flight line where Squadron 442 was finally preparing for deployment with aircraft that had been completely rebuilt using fuel systems that met actual specifications rather than the compromised components that foreign sabotage had nearly made standard. Captain, I've been thinking about my career path, and I've realized something. I was never supposed to be a pilot. I was supposed to be exactly what I became: someone who could see patterns in information systems that others couldn't recognize. My elimination from flight training wasn't a failure that relegated me to administrative work. It was preparation for work that turned out to be more important than I ever understood. Thompson smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd watched a subordinate discover their true professional calling. Rodriguez, you've gone from being dismissed as paperwork Mari to becoming one of the most valuable analytical specialists in the entire defense establishment. Some people get recognition for doing their jobs well. You got recognition for redefining what the job should be. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Whitmore Air Force Base, Mari walked through the facility that had become the center of defense supply chain security for the entire military. The Defense Supply Chain Security Center bore no resemblance to Building 127, but it served the same fundamental purpose: ensuring that the documentation and systems that supported military operations functioned with the precision that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her decision about the Pentagon assignment would determine whether she spent her career briefing senior leaders or continuing the analytical work that had exposed systematic threats to national security. Either path represented vindication beyond anything she'd imagined during those years of cleaning files and maintaining databases that everyone dismissed as bureaucratic necessities. But as she passed the wall display showing real-time monitoring of defense contractor activities across the globe, Mari realized that her greatest professional satisfaction came not from recognition or promotion, but from knowing that pilots like those in Squadron 442 could trust that their aircraft had been built and maintained with components that met actual specifications rather than the substandard alternatives that foreign intelligence services had been systematically substituting. Paperwork Mari had become Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, analytical specialist whose work had prevented what could have been the worst aviation disaster in Air Force history. More importantly, she'd become exactly who she was supposed to be, someone whose obsessive attention to documentation details had exposed threats that traditional intelligence methods had completely missed. The transformation was complete, but the work of protecting American military capabilities from sophisticated foreign sabotage was just beginning. And Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was exactly where she belonged, at the center of systems that turned information into intelligence, patterns into prevention, and bureaucratic details into national security. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in the sky but in the files that determined whether aircraft could reach the sky at all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.